Right, folks, moving right on now to our token whitefella. No, that's not true. He's not a token whitefella here at all. Being in the highfalutin world of academia, I've been observing over the last 3 or 4 years those who are courageous enough within the academy to be speaking out and challenging some of the nonsense that's peddled by the likes of the Cape York cane toad, Noel Pearson, and the nutty professor, Marcia from Melbourne Uni, and amongst the very few academics who've been courageous in their speaking out and have been fearless in their challenging the nonsense that is peddled by some of these people, has been our next speaker, Mr. Jon Altman. So give him a welcome, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of Melbourne. I would also like to acknowledge the fantastic work that's done by the social movement Concerned Australians, of which I have to say I'm a member. And I would also like to point out that some of their material is available for sale at the back. I'd also like to acknowledge the fantastic publishing work of the Arrernte project and its particular attention to issues of injustice and racism. I single out for praise Alison Caddick, who's sitting somewhere here, who commissioned Coercive Reconciliation, a publication by Arrernte in June of 2007. She could see the significance of the intervention as it was announced and quickly commissioned a response by 30 Indigenous and non-Indigenous commentators. And Alison, of course, is the lead editor of Arrernte magazine that Gary's going to launch in some manner later this evening. Today was going to be Liberation Day, 5 years after Mal Brough was going to stabilise, normalise and then exit 73 prescribed communities in the Northern Territory. Instead, it's a day of shame when Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory have to endure yet again another anniversary of the Northern Territory National Emergency Response Intervention as demeaned peoples, marginalised, disempowered, encapsulated in the Australian settler colonial state. I'm proud as a non-Indigenous person to be sharing this forum with Gary, Barb, Ros and Les. These are Indigenous people who are actively resisting attempts by the hegemonic Australian state to demolish their ways of being, seeking to convert them via a draconian project of moral restructuring into subservient, normalised citizens. What are the political masters and their compliant bureaucratic elites imagining with their top-down project to normalise and close gaps? The imposition of unconscionable pain for what anticipated gain? Like long discredited Washington consensus social engineers, Canberra proposes abstract utopian futures for remote living Aboriginal people. 95% employment in imagined real jobs, like in the rest of society. Healthy living and public housing to be privatised and individualised. Kids happily ensconced in quality schools with 100% attendance, learning the formula for success in late modernity in the Queen's English. And adults enjoying unimpeded access to alcohol, pornography and gambling. This is just Canberra dreaming. It is not Aboriginal dreaming. It's not Jukupa, Jung, Margayan or Rom. And it is intentionally destructive of Aboriginal societies with only one end game: assimilation. Next week, on the 30th of June, the National Partnership Agreement to close the gap in the Northern Territory, the Rudd and Gillard government's technocistry badging of the intervention ends. Yesterday, with now standard provocative media spin, we get the latest monitoring report on closing the gap in the Northern Territory. That tells us absolutely nothing about closing any gaps, as it lacks any information about those outside so-called prescribed areas. There's nothing there about closing gaps. Careful reading of this report, like countless others since 2007, focuses on statistics rather than on-the-ground reality. Yet, even this report and many like it cannot conceal debacle after debacle, failure after failure, although the media spin tells us nothing of this. Barb's mentioned some of these figures. Unemployment and welfare dependence remains extraordinarily high. 80% of adults in prescribed areas are on some form of income support. Of these, 60% are on compulsory income quarantining, with no evidence that this is doing anything but demeaning people. School attendance is down to less than 60%, despite punitive school enrolment and attendance measures that take away your form of income support if your kids don't turn up to school. The Housing National Partnership Program aims to house 10 people per house. That's its aspirational aim, 4 times the national average, with new houses only to be delivered to 15 large communities out of a total of over 600 in the Northern Territory. Child hospitalisation is still running at a rate of 258 per thousand. 258 per thousand. And suicide and self-harm rates are 5 times higher than in 2007. 5 times higher than when the intervention began. Although we are informed in the latest report that this may reflect better reporting because of better policing. If this rate was applied to Melbourne, this would constitute 26,000 incidents per annum. Can you imagine that? 26,000 suicide and self-harm incidents per annum in Melbourne. The Australian state has done some things well. Its panoptic technologies are probably unrivalled in the world. The expenditures of the income quarantined are electronically monitored. School attendance is closely watched and is increasingly linked to welfare payments. These payments are subject to activity testing and no-show, no-pay rules, with rates of poverty-enhancing non-payment escalating and proudly interpreted by the state as disciplining the unworthy. And residents of public housing are carefully listed by housing authorities, and these include landowners who pay rent for houses, for public houses, but receive no rent for public housing estates built on their traditional lands. Such deployment of surveillance to discipline as an apparatus of power does not come cheap, and it has seen extraordinary waste. Over $500 million has been spent on the institution of the Basics Card for income management. $500 million. Up to $500 million is available to Territory Housing to support property and tenancy management reform. Those two add up to $1 billion between them. Nearly $200 million has been spent on the institution of the government business manager, the new superintendent of prescribed communities. There is no political accountability for such waste. Only the Australian Greens ask questions. The coalition opposition is pathetically acquiescent. And just to please Gary, no, seriously, just like the Rudd opposition was when this farce began. They're as bad as each other. And this is set to continue for another 10 years with a set of measures called Stronger Futures in the Northern Territory. Stronger, one suspects, as Barbara hinted, for layers of bureaucracy and rent-seeking businesses and contractors, with no evidence that any of this is working. Report after report from the Australian National Audit Office, the Commonwealth Ombudsman, even government departments and their consultants are politely scathing. The Department of Education's in-house evaluation comparing so-called SEAM and non-SEAM children. We're getting this new terminology. SEAM is the school enrolment and attendance measures. So we have some kids who are SEAMed and some kids who are non-SEAMed. Well, this sort of terminology is deployed, but what it shows is that SEAM is making no difference. Things are so bad that just this week the Queensland government has pulled the pin. Education Minister, the Honourable John Paul Langbroke, bluntly declaring SEAM did not work. This is a punitive measure that did not work in Queensland that's about to be expanded and extended next door in the Northern Territory for 10 more years. And also this week we hear from News Limited, no less, moral champions of the intervention, until today when we heard nothing from them, that despite all the Commonwealth pump priming, super shires in the Northern Territory that replaced Aboriginal community government are on the road to nowhere, with almost all operating with budget deficits. Imagine if Aboriginal community councils tried to operate with budget deficits. In the opening editorial to the special intervention issue we launched tonight, Melinda Hinkson and I ask, is the future hopeless? Is the future hopeless? Of course not. There is resistance smoke, and it's starting to billow. And where there is resistance smoke, there will be fire. I see some hope. I saw it earlier this week when we had an event in Parliament House where Barb was, in an emerging alliance between the non-Indigenous precariat and Indigenous people, uniting to challenge the income management institution, unique to Australia in the whole world. An alliance that has been fuelled as a surprising unintended outcome of the government's desperation to appear non-racist internationally. I see it in the action of the Queensland Conservative government. Did I say that, Les? Enough waste is enough. And I do see it with some heroic people in Canberra, like the Commonwealth Ombudsman's Office, that put out scathing reports about government programs in the Northern Territory, and their Indigenous unit is about to be defunded at the end of next week. I see it in the precariousness of late capitalism. Indigenous difference has to be in the mix as we all face uncertain futures. Enough of this multi-layered debacle. The intervention and the rebadged closing the gaps in the Northern Territory have been shameful failures built on top-down, brutalising paternalism. It is time to re-empower community. Thank you.
Thank you, John.